14,000 municipal enterprises generate hundreds of billions of hryvnias in revenue, yet many of them operate at a loss.
In a monopolistic market, there is very little incentive for internal transformation. Since 2016, legislation has allowed for the establishment of supervisory boards in municipal enterprises.
The big question is, who exactly is the owner in a municipal enterprise?
A company with strong corporate governance is more attractive to any investor.
What trends do you see in corporate governance in Ukraine, particularly in municipal enterprises?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today we are joined by Volodymyr Igonin. Volodymyr is a partner at the law firm Vasil Kisil and Partners, as well as Yuliia Mincheva. Yuliia is an advisor to the mayor of Mykolaiv. She works on, among other things, corporate governance issues in municipal enterprises. And Roman Kuzyuk. Roman is a member of Supervisory Boards of Ukrainian companies and an author. Today we will discuss with our colleagues issues related to corporate governance in municipal enterprises. Colleagues, good afternoon.
Greetings.
Good afternoon.
Ukraine has a large number of municipal enterprises. They differ significantly in size. The criticality of the services they provide also differs. I heard that 14,000 municipal enterprises generate hundreds of billions of hryvnias in revenue, yet many of them operate at a loss. This is understandable as they provide socially important services and profitability is not their primary objective. There is no consolidated public data covering all municipal enterprises, specifically where corporate governance has been implemented, where boards exist, or where supervisory boards have been established. Unfortunately, such information is not available anywhere. However, as experts who work with these issues, could you share your perspective on how widespread the implementation of boards of directors and supervisory boards in municipal enterprises actually is?
It is indeed the right question to ask, especially when trying to understand how many of these municipal enterprises currently exist. I am very glad we are recording this podcast at a time when many people are thinking about municipal enterprises, something that was not the case before. During blackouts and disruptions, especially in Kyiv, basic services like water, heating, and electricity fall directly under municipal enterprises, not the blackout situation itself. Please don't misunderstand, but specifically the provision of these services to the population. What used to be perceived as a basic given is now seen almost as a luxury. And it raises a fair question: what is actually happening inside these municipal enterprises? What condition are they in, given that many are loss-making? But in reality, they do not always have to be loss-making, nor are they loss-making solely because they are municipally owned. This is fundamentally a governance issue, one that historically has not been viewed through the lens of corporate governance, despite the fact that since 2016 there has been legislation allowing for the establishment of supervisory boards in municipal enterprises, regardless of other factors. So these boards can still be created today, and they do exist. However, there are two approaches, one that has historically prevailed and another that is now beginning to emerge. You could compare them to a smoker's supervisory board versus a healthy person's supervisory board. Supervisory boards in the municipal sector were often made up solely of local council members and had little real authority. For instance, they might have had the authority to review a director's report or financial statements, but not to approve them or provide substantive comments, reservations, or recommendations. Examples include supervisory boards at Zhytomyr Vodokanal and Vodokanal, mostly are deputies. These members usually have no authority and are generally unpaid. It is difficult to say that such boards embody the true spirit of corporate governance. In contrast, there is an established practice in the Western world. It is mostly something enshrined in the organization's principles and declarations, namely those of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where corporate governance is defined, something I hope we have come here to discuss and explain. These frameworks define real authority, a clear division of roles between the owner, management, and the supervisory board, as well as strategic direction and the board's key role in delivering on the company's mission and vision. At present, there are only 3 such supervisory boards in Ukraine's municipal sector that follow this model, 2 in Lviv and 1 in Mykolaiv. In Lviv, these include the water utility and Lviv Svitlo. In Mykolaiv, it is the water utility. Very soon, a contest will be launched to appoint independent members to the supervisory board of Mykolaiv Electrotrans. Now, this is a public transport company. If you are interested in trams or trolleybuses. That said, there is quite a lot of movement overall. In 2019, the Kyiv City Council adopted a decision outlining the criteria under which the establishment of a supervisory board in a municipal enterprise becomes mandatory. There were 3 criteria, you can review them: asset size, number of employees, and the amount of statutory capital. Based on these criteria, as of 2019, there should already be 13 supervisory boards in place today. These are all enterprises that we rely on daily. This includes entities like Kyivteplenergo, Kyiv Metro, and Kyiv Vodokanal. They still haven't been created, and there must be reasons for that. In other words, they could have been created. A formal decision to establish them already exists, yet they have not been created. So we can say that there is a model available for implementation, but in practice, pardon the tautology, there are very few real examples. At present, there are only 3 that can be considered benchmark cases, and I hope they will become exemplary over time.
I would assume that beyond the 3 boards you mentioned, there may be one or a few others in different cities that are simply less visible to the public.
No offense taken. Yes, that is probably a disclaimer.
And perhaps we're simply not aware of them. By the way, if such boards do exist, please step forward. We invite you in particular to showcase your work through the Professional Association of Corporate Governance. We actively promote strong case studies because, frankly speaking, corporate governance still lacks widely recognized public success stories, cases where a company can say, we established a supervisory board and it successfully delivered on its mandate. This gap is evident across the private, state-owned and municipal sectors alike. So there is clearly significant room for development. The potential is there. And indeed, supervisory boards are an instrument that do not provide answers to all questions. They should not be seen as a quick fix for systemic issues such as deteriorated infrastructure, inefficient public transport fleets, or other structural challenges. A supervisory board does not arrive and resolve all of this overnight. That's simply not how it works. But the fact that they can help is undeniable. I think we will talk more about this today, how exactly this contributes to achieving these results.
It is also interesting that our growing focus on corporate governance in municipal enterprises is taking place against the broader transformation of capitalism from a shareholder-centric model to a stakeholder-oriented one. And in essence, a municipal enterprise with a large number of stakeholders must be governed properly. Corporate governance should exist in these enterprises. Moreover, if we look at ISO 37000, it offers a broader interpretation of governance than the OECD principles, emphasizing governance of the organization as a whole, with significant attention to stakeholder relationships.
Volodymyr, you were directly involved in shaping and legally structuring the supervisory boards of Lviv-Vodokanal and Mykolaiv-Vodokanal. Am I correct? And I have a few questions. First, what were the key challenges you encountered in this process? And secondly, why is it that while cities like Lviv and Mykolaiv, and even some of their satellite municipalities already have supervisory boards in their water utilities, Kyiv, for example, still does not? And finally, what are the things that absolutely should be done when implementing supervisory boards, and what could be considered red flags in this process? So these are 3 clusters of questions specifically related to the cases of establishing supervisory boards at Lviv-Vodokanal and Mykolaiv-Vodokanal.
Thank you for this comprehensive set of questions. We worked more closely and extensively with Mykolaiv. With Lviv, our role was more methodological. We provided guidance, but were not directly involved in the legal establishment process. In Mykolaiv, our involvement was significantly deeper. Why is this not as widespread as one might expect? First of all, it's important to note that these are relatively recent cases. Yes, this is a new practice. We're talking about 2024, 2025. In contrast, in the state-owned sector, supervisory boards have existed for quite some time in the largest companies, albeit with varying degrees of effectiveness. This alone could be the subject of an entire podcast, but at least it's not new territory for state-owned enterprises. In the municipal sector, however, the challenges are different. One of the key questions is, who exactly is the owner of a municipal enterprise? This is a very interesting question because, on the one hand, all residents of a community are considered the owners, and from an economic perspective, they do have some kind of stake in the municipal enterprise, but legally they do not hold any share, and the community has no legal entity status in this sense. The community's agency essentially begins and ends with voting in elections for or against the people who then influence policy. And only very indirectly does this reach something like a water utility or an electric transport company. So this is not that kind of owner, not even a general shareholders meeting where you could at least once a year come and vote on certain decisions. Yet economically, they are indeed the stakeholders. Now let's move on. Who else can be an owner? The city council? The city council is by definition a collegial body. That means it consists of dozens of individuals, and this in itself is part of the challenge. Because wherever responsibility is collective, it becomes inherently more difficult to manage, control, and channel that shared will into concrete decisions. There is also another key actor, the mayor. This is yet another representative of the collective owner, and a great deal depends on this role. In my personal view, Mykolaiv was somewhat fortunate in this regard, as there was a clearly articulated political will at the level of the mayor. Based on my observations, this played a very positive role in the establishment of supervisory boards in the first municipal enterprises there. So the first challenge is ensuring that the owner's will is clearly formulated and then properly formalized both in substance and in procedure. The second challenge relates to our international partners who provide technical, financial and expert support across many institutional reforms. And they have this term building consensus, meaning the process of building consensus. How would you translate consensus into Ukrainian?
Some kind of agreement in general, or more broadly?
Building agreement. And I really like this phrase because it is important. If only the owner decides to introduce corporate governance in the broad sense and a supervisory board in the narrower sense, that alone is not sufficient. The system is too complex. If there is resistance at any level, the reforms will stall and ultimately fail to deliver results. That is why alignment across stakeholders is absolutely critical. There is in fact a common myth. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. Directors and executive management are always opposed to the creation of a supervisory board. This is something one hears quite often. Personally, I strongly disagree with that view. I think it would be valuable to discuss this further. We have an experienced executive at the table, Sergiy, and as a former CEO, I believe you are well placed to either confirm or challenge this assumption.
Absolutely. Although in the company where I was CEO, this company was listed on Euronext, a French public company, and there the board was governed by French law. At the same time, this clearly requires a certain level of maturity from both shareholders and top management. In one of the companies where we introduced a supervisory board, one of the owners later remarked, after the board had been reconstituted as we were the first composition and were subsequently replaced, he mentioned that his assessment of management readiness was no more than 10%. After that, I separately spoke with the top management of this company, and they indeed said that only over time did they understand how it works and why it is needed. We worked with them directly, the board together with top management, to explain this, but there were clear preconceptions. For example, board members do provide oversight and sometimes ask quite unclear questions. They often don't really understand much at all. On the other hand, there were concerns that the owner had created the board as a way to eventually replace top management with board members. This requires communication, it requires a certain level of engagement from top management in the work of the board so they can see how the board operates and what issues it considers. It is also important that the board provides a certain level of reporting. What did the board plan? What did it deliver? Of course, not all matters can be disclosed to management, but in terms of planning and feedback loops, this is extremely valuable.
Let's be honest, this is a profound transformation. It is a shift in management philosophy. When a director has spent their entire career operating within a Soviet or post-Soviet management paradigm, accustomed to reporting to a mayor or a city official, and suddenly a collegial body, a supervisory board, is introduced, this represents a fundamental change. And like any major transformation, it must be implemented properly. It's not just about making a decision and that's it. Now go ahead and work with the supervisory board. You have to prepare people for this, help them navigate these changes, understand them, and learn how to use this technology. Because in principle, I personally view corporate governance simply as a technology. And this technology requires the user to be competent. Just like when you buy a device in a store, no one really likes reading the manual.
But when something breaks,
yes, I don't enjoy reading manuals either. It should be user-friendly.
but here, if something breaks,
It is very simple. It's not a microwave, you know. This is a serious and fairly complex system. There are many rules involved, and someone needs to understand how it all works.
it's better if everyone does.
That's why one of the key challenges is ensuring that the people operating within this corporate governance paradigm have a sufficient level of understanding and the willingness to implement it. Otherwise, resistance can be so strong that even the best initiatives simply stall. And to address the last question I haven't yet commented on, why these cases remain relatively limited so far, it's difficult for me to say. Most likely, it comes down to the political will of specific local officials. Hopefully, including through initiatives like Sergiy's program, we'll see more decisions at the local level to at least begin moving toward proper corporate governance in municipal enterprises. That would be a great result.
In general, it's very difficult to want something you don't understand. It's almost impossible to recognize the need for something if you don't even know what it is. So that's probably the primary issue. The second point is what was mentioned earlier, not exactly in this context, but regarding experience in the public sector. Unfortunately, it is not successful enough to make others want to adopt it. And while negative cases tend to receive wide attention, positive examples are often underreported, leading to a distorted overall perception of the topic. It is usually mostly framed framed by a negative connotation, with stories about huge salaries, lack of real work, and constant scandals. And these scandals are often, especially recent ones, quite valid. They actually fall within the scope of what corporate governance is supposed to address. As a result, there is a perception gap. You say this will lead to a better future, yet in practice we see cases where it fails to deliver even basic standards, whether in oversight, accountability, compliance, or anti-corruption, in the very companies often cited. That contradiction naturally fuels skepticism. So it's not entirely fair to say that people simply don't understand and therefore resist. Understanding is part of the story, but even with understanding, there must be a clear internal articulation of the problem. And often the problems we identify may not be perceived as such by city councils, because the added value of corporate governance is not always immediately tangible. It's not a simple buy for 10, sell for 20 equation with an obvious profit. This is a long-term game. It does not guarantee a bright future, but when implemented properly, it significantly increases the likelihood of achieving one. That's why three key factors come into play: lack of understanding, lack of strong positive track records to outweigh negative narratives, and third, there is insufficient internal motivation, that sense of urgency about the problem. The prevailing mindset is often, it works as it is, so why change anything? And it is precisely within this third factor, the lack of urgency, that the greatest hidden leverage lies, as well as the biggest opportunity for all of us to act. Because motivation tends to come either from aspiration or from pressure. And in many cases, pressure is the more effective driver. When you operate in a monopolistic environment, there are very few incentives for internal transformation. There is no competition pushing you forward. And that creates a deeply problematic situation. In fact, this is one of the core reasons why the municipal sector often struggles with efficiency. Structurally, it is difficult to be efficient when there are ongoing subsidies from the owner and when losses do not necessarily lead to consequences. Many such enterprises operate at a loss. If you were managing an unprofitable enterprise, you probably would no longer be managing it. Either you would be replaced or the business itself would cease to exist. Because who needs a non-profitable enterprise? And yet, these enterprises continue operating for years. A director knows that, yes, today there may be a deficit, say a notional 200 million, but tomorrow 300 million will arrive. Salaries will be paid because water and electricity are essential services. No one is prepared to take the political responsibility of shutting such an enterprise down. And therefore, there are no internal drivers for change, which is why it requires a profound level of awareness to recognize that only a fundamental shift in management philosophy can truly change the situation.
There is also an additional nuance, taking responsibility by the person who initiates the creation of a supervisory board. It's the mayor, and this deserves real credit in the cases of Lviv and Mykolaiv, where the mayors assumed responsibility for initiating such decisions. And returning to the biases of top management and the difficulties and internal challenges that arise as a result, one highly effective practice is to provide training to part of the top management team before introducing a supervisory board. In Ukraine, there are two institutions that specialize in corporate governance education. These include UCGA, the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy, and CGPA, the Corporate Governance Professional Association, which, together with the Ukrainian Institute of Corporate Governance, deliver the Corporate Director Program. By the way, Volodymyr and I are members of the board of CGPA, the Corporate Governance Professional Association.
And lecturers.
And I'm a graduate. It was great. In Mykolaiv, we also ran an educational program. Volodymyr taught there, and Alexander Okunev delivered training sessions as well, because it is critically important that everyone speaks the same language. It is far better to establish that alignment at the outset than to face misunderstandings later on.
On a personal note, I happen to be one of the longest-standing members of CGPA.
Awesome.
Since 2011, and twice a winner of the Corporate Secretary of the Year award by CGPA.
Awesome.
Yes, this is our professional domain.
We'll be happy to share this experience with your corporate secretaries.
Yuliia, absolutely. We're open to collaboration.
It is commonly believed that the state or, for example, a city council cannot effectively manage an enterprise or run a business efficiently. As a result, there is a view that state-owned and municipal enterprises should be privatized so that they gain a commercial private owner, potentially also an investor, who can further develop these businesses and service providers at the municipal level. In your opinion, which approach is more appropriate? Should we implement corporate governance and professionalize company management through it, or should such enterprises be moved toward privatization?
I would not take on the responsibility of giving a definitive answer. What I can say is that Ukraine has recently introduced a very strong initiative which has now become a legislative norm. We finally have a comprehensive state ownership policy. That ownership policy was adopted on November 29, 2024. This is a fully developed comprehensive policy document on state ownership. What is it and why does it matter? The Constitution contains a very powerful provision, just 2 words, that is rarely mentioned. It states, ownership is duty. And this is in fact a very important message. If something belongs to you, then you are responsible for how that property is used. This is a multi-layered idea, because on the one hand, it means that your assets must be used efficiently and that you are responsible for ensuring your business is profitable and financially sustainable. On the other hand, it also means that as the owner, you are responsible for the consequences that arise from that property. So, if it is, for example, a power plant, and there may be significant environmental or other consequences or social risks, then you as the owner must also take responsibility for these. And in the state ownership policy, and I encourage everyone to read this document, there is a whole section called Objectives of State Ownership. The purpose of this section is to ensure that the owner, when looking at the assets it holds, roughly 3,000 enterprises of various forms under state control, including both state enterprises and joint stock companies where the state holds a controlling stake. The state, as an owner, should assess each enterprise and clearly define the rationale for retaining ownership, specifically why these companies are not being privatized and why they are considered unsuitable for transfer to market mechanisms or private ownership. Because in the economic system Ukraine is building, private ownership generally delivers better results. However, in certain cases, state ownership is justified. And these cases are clearly defined in the state ownership policy. Therefore, in my view, a similar approach should be applied at the level of municipal enterprises as well. If a local community understands that it cannot privatize its water utility, although in fact there are cities in Ukraine where water utilities are privately owned, and as far as I know, water still flows from the taps there, but I'm not an economist, so I won't go deeper into that debate right now. What matters is that the community must take a close look at its municipal enterprises and first and foremost clearly ask itself, why do we need this enterprise? Obviously, this will likely lead to the conclusion that not all enterprises are truly necessary. Those that are not needed should either be liquidated if they serve no meaningful purpose and their maintenance costs outweigh any benefit, especially if they do not fulfill an important social function, or put them up for privatization. However, the framing that it is either corporate governance or privatization is not entirely accurate. In fact, they can coexist. You can have both privatization and corporate governance, especially in cases of partial privatization. For example, in cases of partial privatization, when the state owns 100% of shares and sells a stake, this can be a very effective solution. In such cases, where both the state and a private investor are shareholders, corporate governance becomes essential. It is the mechanism that allows different interests to be aligned and properly managed. So this is not an either-or, it can be a comprehensive approach.
It's like that old saying, what's better, being poor and healthy or rich and sick? In reality, it's better to be both rich and healthy. The same logic applies here. Corporate governance is like good lifestyle habits. It certainly won't harm you, and if everything is done well, it actually enhances your ability to achieve broader goals. A company with strong corporate governance is more attractive to any investor. No one wants to buy a pig in a poke, even if the purchase is primarily about acquiring land. Unless it's purely a transactional case like that, you still want the business to be well managed. And if you are not selling it, then it's even more important, because you as the owner will ultimately bear the consequences of losses or benefit from success. So ultimately, it depends on how you answer this fundamental question. And I also disagree with the idea that the state or a city cannot be an inefficient owner. These are not inherently antagonistic or mutually exclusive concepts. Yes, it can. No, it can be effective and it can also be ineffective. The question is what is needed to make it effective rather than ineffective, and whether those conditions exist now, whether they can be created, and at what cost. And this is precisely where corporate governance comes in. It provides something like a handbook, a framework, a manual, what should be done to ensure things work well, and what should be avoided on the flip side. In that sense, it helps you become an effective owner. And no, it is not required everywhere. In some cases, you can adopt only specific elements, for example, a risk management system. Personally, I have yet to see anyone whose life was actually harmed by having a risk management system. It can be applied to any organization, and in fact, it is already a standard component of strong management practices at virtually any organizational level. Similarly, structured procurement procedures are something every organization needs. Do you need a supervisory board? No, you don't. It's not meant for everyone. It is expensive and time-consuming, and there is a range of issues that can easily be handled by a director, where there is no social significance or critical impact on the population, for example, cases where a supervisory board is not necessary. This ability to distinguish not so much good from bad, but the sense of proportion, is where the owner's responsibility is demonstrated, as in the Constitution, where ownership entails responsibility and requires you to determine what you will do with it.
Well, organically following what you said, I would like, based on my personal experience, to ask you a question. About a year ago, I served in the Ministry of Defense working in the Project Management and Institutional Development Office. And in my specialization in corporate governance, we conducted an analysis of state-owned enterprises under the Ministry of Defense with the aim of proper corporatization, consolidation, and implementing corporate governance where it is appropriately applicable. And, one of the top 5 criteria, for example, was the extent and proportion of state defense orders within a given enterprise. So here's my question. Let's imagine we could create a registry of municipal enterprises based on certain criteria, if not all, then at least the core ones across Ukraine, say the top 1,000. What criteria, in your view, top 3 or top 5, would serve as triggers indicating that a supervisory or advisory function, specifically a supervisory board, should be implemented in those enterprises? What do you think those criteria would be?
In my view, the first is critical infrastructure, for obvious reasons. The second could be the size of the charter capital. Although this requires context, Kyiv is not Mykolaiv, Mykolaiv is not Chernivtsi, and Chernivtsi is not Zviahel.
Was it based on the charter or actually on turnover?
It could be both.
Because charter capital with capitalization very often
can instead be reflected in total assets or simply in net revenue. It really depends on how you, as the owner, understand your enterprise, what that charter capital actually represents and how it is being replenished. What does this share actually indicate for you? But yes, ultimately, it's some kind of financial indicator because you can't realistically apply a single benchmark across entities of very different sizes.
Of course, yes.
You can define a baseline threshold and then, especially at the level of local self-government, allow each authority to determine that threshold for itself. The number of employees can also be a criterion. Broadly speaking, if you have, say, 250 to 500 employees, you are most likely dealing with something substantial, where the potential consequences are significant. Another point is that it is not necessary to meet 3 criteria. 1 may be sufficient, and from there you can assess what governance tools you actually need. But the key idea here is simply to start addressing the issue. It's very encouraging that the Ministry of Defense is working on this and actively thinking about it. If I had to distill one core takeaway from this entire discussion, it would be what we are talking about right now. This approach to governance is only just beginning to emerge at the city level. The very fact that municipalities are starting to think in these terms, about ownership, about what they actually have, is already a transformative shift. We are not yet at the stage where there are extensive debates about how to do it, because the discussion is still about whether it needs to be done at all and what it even is. Then you can assess in practice whether holding structures actually work. Should we consolidate 3 large companies into one? Does that actually create efficiencies through centralization, or does it simply introduce greater management risks? Therefore, until there is established practice, until we see some municipalities consolidated into holdings, others remaining independent, some large water utilities with supervisory boards, and smaller ones without them, but with alternative mechanisms such as internal audit or risk management systems. Only then will it make sense to sit down and determine which types of entities require a holding structure and which do not. At this stage, these discussions remain largely abstract and lack practical grounding. The key priority now is to start approaching this ownership with a true owner's mindset.
It is also worth noting that when you mentioned the holding model, it prompted me to consider whether it would be worthwhile to at least explore and discuss such an approach. In larger municipalities, where there are numerous enterprises, creating a holding structure could indeed be a viable option.
In Kyiv, for example, there are cases where enterprises operate as private joint stock companies, such as a water utility, where ownership is split between the municipality and private shareholders. So isolated examples exist. There are no fully pure cases combining complete corporate governance and everything else. It is also important that some time must pass. Establishing a supervisory board is, in fact, probably the easiest part of the process. You appoint individuals, sign contracts, and formally declare that a supervisory board exists. The most interesting part is when they actually operate, and they operate for a long time. It takes at least 1, 2, or preferably 3 years before one can assess whether they have effectively advised, overseen, and provided strategic direction.
Exactly.
Only then can we evaluate whether the model has truly delivered value. And therefore, without this continuity in time, it is difficult to look back and reflect on what exactly should be in the supervisory board of a holding, how many people are needed, what profile they should have, because this is still an ongoing process.
In the municipal sector, I can note that there is a legislative initiative aimed at introducing and supporting sound corporate governance principles in municipal enterprises. This is an initiative of Member of Parliament Oleksiy Movchan, and I think that within the first quarter, possibly in the spring, this draft law may be registered. The proposed approach entails that corporate governance mechanisms, including supervisory boards, would be introduced only in the most significant municipal enterprises. When modeling was done to assess how many of these 14,000 are actually important, the same criteria currently used for the state sector were applied. And that is logical. If you use these criteria for the state sector, why not apply them to the municipal sector as well? As a result of this modeling, roughly 50 to 60 municipal enterprises across Ukraine would fall within these criteria. This means that, for all others, if you want, you can do it voluntarily. But in these cases, if the law is adopted, you will be required to establish a supervisory board. It is also quite interesting that this hypothesis demonstrated almost full geographic coverage across the country. The majority of regions were included in this sample. Typically, these are enterprises in district heating, transport, and water utilities. These are entities that objectively meet the parameters. No one selectively picked them. The outcome emerged naturally from the applied criteria. They ended up there.
I see, so essentially a criticality criterion?
It is not criticality. At this stage, it is rather a criterion for large enterprises, an economic size-based approach.
Yeah, understood. Thank you for the detailed and well-structured response.
Given the specifics of appointments and, more broadly, decision-making around the establishment of supervisory boards in municipal enterprises, it is clear that there may be a certain degree of political influence involved. After all, local councils must vote on such decisions, and the future of a supervisory board may, to some extent, remain in the hands of elected officials. For various political reasons, changes may occur that effectively undermine what has already been put in place. How can such risks be mitigated?
I have a concise answer. In short, no way. And moreover, there is a continuation. There is nothing wrong with politics. Politics exists everywhere. It is not limited to what we traditionally refer to as politics. It is also present in business environments, and even at the level of ownership, where an owner may decide to establish a supervisory board today and dissolve it tomorrow. In practice, both at the state and local level, there are still formal documents that must be adopted. So deputies do not simply sit around a table over tea and decide to dissolve a board. They need to prepare and justify a formal decision. There are clearly defined criteria for terminating the powers of a supervisory board. They must secure a quorum. They must convince a large number of deputies that this is not needed. It's not that, while it is possible, it is not something that can be done overnight. There are, in fact, considerably more procedural and bureaucratic safeguards that either delay such decisions or at least create a window for reflection, certainly more so than in the private sector, where, in some cases, a single message or phone call could effectively terminate a board's function, particularly in non-public companies, which are the vast majority in Ukraine. In such cases, decisions tend to be highly dependent on the owner's discretion and sentiment. This is not a critical concern. There are safeguards in place, including formal decision-making requirements. If the law is adopted, it will introduce an additional constraint at the municipal level. You will not be able to avoid establishing a supervisory board where it is mandated. That said, I would be less concerned about the risk of boards being easily dismantled and more focused on ensuring that there is no incentive to do so in the first place. As a rule, if a supervisory board performs its function effectively, there are no valid reasons to remove it, except in cases of clearly harmful conduct. And such harmful conduct would fall outside the scope of corporate governance altogether and may instead become a matter for law enforcement authorities.
This, incidentally, is one of the reasons why a CEO or director might be interested in having a supervisory board. Given the inherently political nature of the process, it can be difficult for a director to advocate a position directly to the owner, especially when the owner is a collective body, such as a municipal council or a mayor. The level and background of stakeholders may vary, whereas a supervisory board is typically composed, at least based on existing examples, of reputable individuals with relevant expertise and authority, collectively carrying more weight than a single director. This enables a kind of collective output and makes it easier to communicate a position to the owner, because, objectively speaking, the owner is not always in a position to fully understand what is realistically achievable. And understanding these boundaries of what is possible is very, very important. And at times, the owner may set unrealistic expectations, while the director may lack the authority or standing to say, with all due respect, while we all support the goal, for example, ensuring clean drinking water, current conditions simply do not make this feasible, and the director may simply not be believed. But if this is confirmed by an independent supervisory board, one that has no conflict of interest, it becomes much easier. It relieves pressure from the CEO and, in fact, enables them to operate more effectively.
By the way, I fully agree with you. Yes, both for the owner and the collective, and for a business owner whose worldview and competencies are often limited. The business is launched and then it scales beyond them. And these experts at different levels can help communicate and demonstrate that the operational director is actually doing the right things, not only in terms of individual performance outcomes, but also in terms of broader organizational processes, decision-making quality, internal coordination, and the overall functioning of governance structures within the company. I also thank Sergiy for always introducing me as a writer. Although I am an author, I have written several books. A writer, in my view, is someone who creates fiction, like Alexandre Dumas. I have mostly written about my experience, and there in my book...
A chronicler?
Exactly, yes.
Which actually is quite accurate.
A novelist chronicler. Awesome. In the book, The Ultimate Beneficiary, I revisited corporate strategy. And there is a standard strategic tool. It is a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, am I right? I allowed myself to combine opportunities and threats into a single category, what we now broadly refer to as trends. From your perspective, what key trends do you see emerging in corporate governance in Ukraine, and specifically in municipal enterprises, over the next 3, 5, or even 8 years? Let's speculate a bit. What developments might occur, and what enabling or potentially adverse factors could shape corporate governance and the evolution of supervisory boards in municipal enterprises?
This is a question that actually requires a lot of thought.
Go ahead, I'll let you start.
You can take a moment to reflect and then add something insightful.
Opportunities and threats.
I would like the trend to become something that is currently completely non-trendy in business in general, so that what are essentially just basic rules of good practice become a trend in the municipal sector. For example, if the internal audit function were to operate effectively, it could have a very tangible impact, even for ordinary citizens who simply turn on the tap and see the quality of the water. Of course, I'm slightly exaggerating here. Water is available, and for many, that alone is already a positive outcome.
Not everyone has access to water.
And that's an important nuance. It is not the fault of water utility employees, but I mean that good governance practices currently missing in the municipal sector, if implemented within 5 years, would already be a major achievement. Second, the role and responsibility of the owner need to become clearer and more defined. There should be a concrete understanding of the purpose behind all of this. These are complex questions, and they are far from obvious. They will require significant internal work. They will require rethinking what we actually expect, particularly from our cities. What requirements do we have for it? Even with something like water supply, should it be free of charge or not? There is no correct answer. There is no handbook you can open and find a definitive rule stating that, for example, in Ukraine in 2025, water must be free. And any answer is correct if it works for you. The key is to find that answer and to build a consensus around it. So if within 5 years there is a clearer understanding of the owner's role and responsibilities, that alone would be a major step forward. And third, if there is greater openness to mistakes, if mistakes are no longer seen as a barrier to implementation and continued practice of these ideas. Because nothing works perfectly on the first attempt. There will inevitably be mistakes. The question is how quickly they are identified, how quickly they are corrected, and what conclusions are drawn from them, so that this openness and reflection on what is happening prevents us from getting stuck in formal criteria. Whether a board has been established or not, whether a policy has been adopted or not, the focus should should shift toward understanding how the system actually works and what can be improved without expecting it to be perfect from the outset. That would be a positive trend.
My expectation is that in the near term, corporate governance and supervisory boards in particular can provide a significant boost to municipal enterprises and local communities. Let me explain why. We are now, I don't know when you will be watching this episode, but we are recording it on February 1st, 2026, in conditions where electricity in different areas is sometimes available only for 3 hours a day, and in some places not for several days at all. This is a shared challenge for everyone. At the same time, there is immense respect for the employees of the municipal sector who are performing truly extraordinary work, sometimes even risking or losing their lives while addressing the damage caused by Russian attacks. It is already clear that the energy system as it existed before the 2020s will not be restored. Most likely, generation will become more decentralized, relying on a larger number of smaller facilities. We are already seeing examples of direct cooperation between international organizations, donors, and local communities, such as the provision of cogeneration units for local integration. Corporate governance is, to some extent, an interface. It is also a kind of common language that makes communication with international partners, donors, and large contractors significantly more effective. As Yuliia rightly noted, it can be harmful when individuals from the private sector engage without understanding the specifics of municipal enterprises. But the opposite can also be harmful. When management consists solely of public sector officials who lack exposure to modern management practices, the outcome is also inefficient. A supervisory board can help bridge this gap and support municipal enterprises. People who, let's be honest, have not usually graduated from business schools and are not very familiar with SWOT analysis, while some individuals, maybe of course people with private sector experience, can enhance engagement with international partners. And this can help everyone. Therefore, it seems to me that this is a very good opportunity for mayors. We have discussed various aspects today, some more general, but this is a very concrete opportunity that can be leveraged to support and improve infrastructure within their respective communities. And secondly, in terms of trends, the most recent selection process for the supervisory board of the Mykolaiv water utility demonstrated a very high level of interest from the private sector, and not only from the private sector, but from candidates overall. A significant number of highly qualified individuals applied, bringing strong expertise. There had been concerns that there would not be enough interest, given that the financial incentives are limited, while the level of responsibility is high and the workload substantial. Practice shows that people want to participate in this, and that is very encouraging. Personally, I view this with considerable optimism.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yuliia, Volodymyr, Roman is currently working on a new book related to corporate governance. Would you be open to including insights from today's discussion in that publication?
We will.
Of course.
Moreover, I would add that
We can only wish you continued creative success.
Thank you. I would also add that Sergiy will be a co-author of the book. He has already been providing support. We have gathered a substantial body of material, and I would like to invite you to become an official contributor to this book on supervisory boards in Ukraine.
It's an honor. I'll keep working on supervisory boards for now. There will be something to write about.
Absolutely.
Yuliia also mentioned that one of the key challenges is awareness of corporate governance. I want to say that today we somewhat addressed this challenge thanks to Sergiy Bulavin's channel.
Sergey is working a lot. We are very grateful that such a platform exists.
We have helped raise awareness to some extent.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this engaging discussion and for the important work you are doing in the field of municipal enterprises. And indeed, it can affect both the professionalism of governing these enterprises and the quality of the services they provide, especially since many of these services are related to people's health, and this can influence the corporate governance market in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on our channel.